Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf, and today our special guest is Dan Wassmann. He works at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and he's a longtime resident of Tall Trees. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, Yvonne. Thanks for having me on the show.
So you wrote a book called Tall Trees and Illustrated History. How did you come about with this topic?
Well, my family has lived in Tall Trees, which is a neighborhood in Glenview, right over near what used to be Scott Forsman, for about 20 years. And it's a great neighborhood. We've really enjoyed living there. And we were celebrating our 50th anniversary as a neighborhood in 2011. And I started thinking that it might be nice to put down in words the history of the neighborhood. And I'd never done a history before, and I was sort of intrigued by the challenge of pulling together information about this neighborhood and how it came to be. And I just sort of jumped in and decided I'd try to write a history, and it was an interesting process.
And you have a background in as a newspaper, right?
Well, for about 12 years, I was a newspaper editor and a newspaper reporter. So I have a background in gathering information, in talking to people, in trying to figure out how to sort of explain, educate people about things in a sort of a newspaper format. And I have to say I kind of applied some of those skills to this. I had to research a lot of information. I spent a lot of hours at the Glenview Library going through the microfilm of old editions of the Glenview announcement and also talking to people.
So you must have gotten to know your neighbors very well.
I did get to know my neighbors pretty well. I've gotten to know it's a great neighborhood, great family neighborhood, and but I had to talk to a lot of people who were there at the start of the neighborhood, and that was 55 years ago. Mm-hmm. We're talking about late 50s, early 60s. And so I had to talk to a lot of people who were thinking about, that's when the neighborhood started.
Yes.
And the first house was occupied in 1961.
I see.
And so I had to talk to people who were thinking about buying lots at the time.
Oh,
it was
yes.
just an open field, just a prairie, and why they decided to do it and what was going on at the time.
Yes. So tell us a little bit of this history, because we know our street names and sections like Swingwood, and how does that tie into Tall Trees?
Well, there was a guy named, a Swedish emigre named Swain Nilsson, who in 1892 bought a bunch of land in Glenview to start a landscape nursery. And he was a very prominent landscape architect, landscape contractor, and so he would
he had a big business.
He had a big business, and he would sell trees for developments all around the Chicago area.
Yes.
Lincoln Park, the Century of Progress, the World's Fair, cemeteries, big estates. He would sell their trees from Glenview are all over the area that this landscape nursery provided.
And that also seemed like where we got many European trees in our neighborhood too, right?
Right. He had to import certain types of trees, maples and lindens that we might not, a lot of shade trees that we might not have had here originally.
Oh, I see.
Because they were in demand, and they worked into what people wanted to buy at the time.
The look, look to the mansions
And ultimately, so it started out in that whole area around Swainwood. So it's over at Waukegan and Shermer, not Waukegan, Glenview Road and Shermer.
Right.
There was sort of and there's that Park District building over here. That was the nursery headquarters. There's that building on, that brick house over
beautiful
on,
brick house.
It's a nice house over on Glenview Road. But he kept buying property. So he bought all this property that ultimately was Swainwood. Mm-hmm. And the Swainwood was developed right after World War II. And then he went across what is now Lake Street, and he bought all the property where that big Scott Forsman development is, where right behind there's a general board of the Methodist Church.
Well, this is a big chunk of Glenview.
Sure. Ultimately, it was at one point it was 300 acres that he was operating in. So it's one piece, and then it sort of juts north across the street, and then it goes east, and it takes in all of Tall Trees.
Yes.
And so that was all part of the landscape nursery at the time. We're talking about in the 20s and the 30s was a thriving landscape nursery.
That's a size like the Chicago Botanical Garden, something like that.
Right. Yeah. It was a big area. And tall trees was a part of that. And so if you, even now, if you look in the neighborhood of tall trees, you might see three big silver maples
yes.
that are strung together. And they could have been part, and they're clearly older than 50 years, and they're clearly the same type of tree, and they're in a straight row, and they're big trees. Now, those might be left over from the nursery. So here and there around tall trees, you are sort of reminded that it used to be a landscape nursery.
I think it's very interesting because when I read your book, it just finally clicked for me why some of our trees are named chestnut, spruce, and pomegranate. There were sections where these trees were grown.
Very possible, very possible. And there's a couple, I mean, some of the kids, though, a lot of those trees had to be cut down, though, when the neighborhood was developed.
Yes.
In fact, I talked to some people who had cut down as many as 50 trees just to be able to clear their lot to build. So some of them remain, but obviously then it became a neighborhood with 200 homes. So
when I saw some of the very large trees we have in the neighborhood, then it makes sense that it must have been one of Swain Nelson's trees.
Oh, sure, sure. Especially though you see those big spruces in some of the neighborhood and things like that. Those were clearly left over from when it was a landscape nursery.
So what happened? What happened after? I mean, he seemed like he was doing so well. His business was doing so well.
I think the business did do well. At one point, they had hundreds of employees, they had big greenhouses, things like that. It shifted during World War II. They shifted their greenhouses to manufacturing facilities for optics, believe it or not, for weapons for World War II. They make like the gun sights for rifles, things like that. And so obviously there probably wasn't that much of a demand for trees during World War II. They had to reallocate those resources for more productive uses during the war effort. But then after the war, I talked to one grandson of Swain Nelson, and he said that the demand sort of went down and became very cost prohibitive to operate the nursery. Just digging out a tree that had grown for 7 years or what was going to be very expensive.
Yes.
And so basically he just described to me that the nursery went belly up, and they had to figure out what they were going to do with that land then. And for, say, about 1945 to, say, about 1960, it was just a prairie. It was just undeveloped land.
So people weren't moving in yet until...
Not yet. There was a developer named Leslie, I think his last name was Burzak, and he had developed some other neighborhoods in Wheeling and Barrington, and he had his eye on that land, at least the tall trees part of it, and decided to try and buy it. And at first, the village wanted that land to be light industrial. Everything that is in the Tall Trees neighborhood, they wanted light industrial. Now he wanted to build residential because he thought there was a demand, and he thought he was going to better be able to sell the houses than try to make it a commercial commercial development. There was a little back and forth with the village board, but ultimately the village board decided that residential was going to be okay, and they started building.
Well, speaking of backing, how about your book? How did you get the backing to publish the book?
Well, with a book like that, there were a couple things. First of all, I just had to write it, okay? And then I had to track down a lot of photos. And I had to get, obviously, photos that related to what I was writing about. And then I was lucky because the Homeowners Association, we have a pretty active Homeowners Association in Tall Trees that serve the 200 residents, 200 homes there. And they said they would finance the publication of the book. So this is a self-published book. But I was lucky because my sister, Ann, who is a longtime graphic designer and worked for many years at the Art Institute of Chicago, she said she would help me design the book.
It's nice to have a professional on board.
Right. It's always nice to have a professional on board, right? Especially when it's your sister, so we had a good working relationship. And she was just very helpful in showing me how to design the book and how to get it ready for self-publishing.
Yes. And the colored photos, does that add to the cost of this book?
Right. If you want to go 4-color in your production, it's going to be a little more expensive than just black and white.
I see.
But it all went pretty well. We got it published. We had it done before the 50th anniversary. We distributed it to the neighbors. I think people really liked it. Yeah, they liked it. We had it in time. We had a big party for the 50th anniversary, and so it was all done for that.
And you have this. You work with historical society as well. in
Well,
the
at
research.
first, just getting started, I wanted the first thing. I mean, so the first thing there were probably on the land that is tall trees. There were probably the Potawatomi Indians, and then people were buying land through the Homestead Act. And if you look at about 1880, I worked with Bev Dawson at the Historical Society. I can remember going over there one day and just looking through these books and looking at the tall trees land and trying to figure out who owned it originally. And it was the Reed family. There were all these members of the Reed family owned that land, just like the Scott Forsman land and also the land where the General Board of the Methodist Church, their operation is now, all over there. And so that whole area could easily be called Reedville or Reedburg. But somehow then they must have sold it to Swain, the Nelsons at some point. They must have changed hands and then became the landscape nursery. So it's probably a farm for the Reed family at some point.
I think your book would be very interesting for our residents who are looking into genealogy and also trying to understand why, for example, we have a huge tree in our backyard.
Right,
and these
right.
our pictures of neighborhoods are there in your book.
Well, I think there was, I mean, at one point they called Glenview the garden suburb, and I don't think it was just Nelson. There were other landscape nurseries in the area. So this was a very popular area for landscape nurseries, obviously because Chicago was growing, so they needed trees and things like that. And I think people in just tall trees, they were interested in the history. For example, there's only one way in and out of tall trees, and there was quite a battle at one point as to figure out why they were going to close that entrance. So you can just get into tall trees now off of Lake Street.
Yes.
And so to have that many homes with just one way in and out is a little unusual because there used to be an entrance off of Chestnut. But in it was about 1981, they closed that. And it was quite a battle because so many people were cutting through that neighborhood. Folks, people were just sort of speeding through the neighborhood, and all the folks either on Silver Willow or Blackthorn were just kind of concerned. And that was a debate that went on for years, whether or not to close the neighborhood. So I think there was just little stories like that I know it's been 35 years, but a lot of the new residents just don't even have that background. So I guess they thought it was interesting.
Yes, yes. Well, tell us about some other books you've written. I mean, you have some background writing for the Federal Reserve as well, right?
I do. I put the Federal Reserve in 1913 celebrated its 100th anniversary, the Federal Reserve System. And the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago.
2013 were the 100th year.
Yes, I'm sorry, in 2013. Well, that's when the Federal Reserve Act was started. And then in 2014 was the start of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. And so I'm in the Public Affairs Department, so I put together sort of a book of photography about just vintage pictures of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, all the different activities that we carry out to promote a strong and stable economy. So we have old pictures of cash operations.
In architecture, I would imagine some of the beautiful buildings in Chicago is related to the Federal Reserve?
I think so. I mean, the architects of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago building, which is right downtown at LaSalle and Jackson. It's the building right kitty corner from the Board of Trade. It's got those big pillars out in front, and that's supposed to give an impression, because it's the central bank of the United States, of strength, an impression of strength and stability. It was designed by a firm called Graham Anderson, Probst and White. And they designed a lot of other well-known buildings, like the Shedd Aquarium downtown. And they did have some connection, I believe, to Daniel Burnham also.
Well, they have some very striking, still very strong 19th century look to that, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, that building was built in 1922. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago started before that, and we were located in office buildings all around the city. And then we consolidated our operations at the big building in LaSalle and Jackson in 1922. So it has a rich history in the city of providing just a wide variety of services to help promote a strong economy. So I thought it'd be interesting to have a book that sort of documented that also.
And there's many pictures in that book too. And so how did you plan out, or how did you work with so many pictures? Do you have to get copyright for these?
Well, right, for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, right, I worked with our library, and every book we had to figure out where it came from and figure out copyright. That was a big. We had
Did
these
it?
spreadsheets of every picture and who sort of owned the rights to the pictures, and they had to grant us copyright approval for that. It was a big job.
Did you have to make a trip to Washington, D.C.?
I did not, because most of the history was sort of local.
Really?
I mean,
Okay.
this is the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago is the local outpost of the Federal Reserve System, which is headquartered in Washington. So most of the information that I needed
just
to
right
get
here.
together, I was able to either just do it during phone calls or just talking to people.
So you would recommend like a spreadsheet too?
Yeah,
Right
just if
now.
you want to get organized for something like
Yes.
that. And then the question is how are you going to present the information? Is it going to be a chronological narrative, or are
Yes.
you going to do it in sort of sections? Now, you know, it's hard getting people to read a long narrative, rambling narrative
Starting
of
from
something.
1913.
Right, right. I mean, so what I tried to do is I sort of tried to break it into sections. Okay, so we at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago are in charge of making sure that there's enough cash in circulation, that it's in good condition, not counterfeit. So I have a whole section on what I called cash currency processing. A whole section on we do a lot of economic research to conduct monetary policy. So I have a whole section on sort of economic research or supervising banks, things like that. Social activities at the bank. We have even a little section on romance at the Fed. I mean, there's all these different prominent
Topics.
leaders of the Fed, things like that.
Yeah.
And then
Has
it's just a
shaped
lot of
Chicago.
photos. Sure, currency that is featured Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago on and things like that. So I organized it by section, and then you can kind of just scan it. You can just pick it up. It's a coffee table book. You can look at it. You can just go to a certain section, and it's not the expectation you're going to read it from start to finish. I just thought that was a better approach, and actually I took that same approach with the Tall Trees book too.
Yes,
You can
yes,
just read
very visual.
We have like a section on famous residents of tall trees
Yes.
over the years, things like that. That was kind of interesting to just figure out what famous people had lived in tall trees over the years.
Did you take any pictures yourself, or
A
was
couple
that?
I had to.
Oh,
A
you
couple
did?
people I
Okay.
interviewed, so I got out I have a little Nikon. And I just took some portraits of people, and they ended up in the book. Just for like the first resident of tall trees, the
that's
current
nice.
oldest resident, things like that. The second president, things like that I just needed photos of. But most of them were photos that I just found in different archives and things like that, or that people gave me.
I think that's a great contribution to residents of Glenview. You have 3 children who grew up here?
I do. I have 3 kids, Elizabeth, Emily, and Peter, and they all graduated from Glenbrook South, grown out of the house. I'm an empty nester now. Have a lot of time on my hands for projects.
Are you ready for another
I shouldn't
book?
say that. Yeah, I'm ready for another book. I got to think about my next project, what that's going to be.
And you also work at another book with your Wassmann?
I did. My father lives in Wilmette, in the same house I grew up in, and he is an artist and has been for many, many years. And he has just canvases all over his house of really nice pictures. So once again, my sister and I teamed up, and we took a photo of 150 pieces of his artwork. And what I did for that one, I just asked him to give me a quote about each picture, what he was thinking, what inspired him, what influenced him, where they were walking that day when he got the idea for the photo. And so we have a nice, obviously most of the book is the photo,
Yes,
but then there's
another-
a quote next to it, and sort of gives you a sense of what, it's sort of a look at it, a little bit of a profile of an artist and all the influences, all the different types of influences they can have to create all these different types of paintings.
Well, this is a very good angle where you're going for, because I see your books are coffee table books, or visual and relaxing, and something that people can read bits at a time.
Right, right. I'm not sure I'm qualified to write a real, a book that you're not going to put down, that's page after page, things like that. But I guess I think I'm more just books you can read in short nuggets here and there, and that are very visual, and that there's a good interplay between the visual and the text. And I also try to caption everything very aggressively, also in all the things I've worked at. So if you're just when you really look at it, and maybe this is going back to my newspaper influences. Even if they're not going to read the article, they might look at the picture, they might read the caption. You're at least going to try and get the information in there, in the hopes that they might then think, hey, I want more detail, and go into it.
And it's laid out for skimming through.
I think so, for the most part, yeah.
So that takes a lot of decision making and choices.
It does. I mean, you have to really get down to the editing and things, what's important. Sometimes with an editor, it's not what you're going to put in. The toughest decisions are what you're going to leave out, because you don't want to overwhelm people with information. You have to make critical decisions about what's really the most important thing for people to know.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're just restricted by a page count, too. I mean, we were at the Tall Trees book. I mean, we had to cut it off at a certain page count based on, I don't know, if it was either going to be, at the end, it was going to be X amount of pages, or you had to jump up another 20 pages to this thing based on the sort of the requirements of the publisher, things like that.
Let's take a look at some of these layouts.
Okay. Well, geez, they just happen to be back here, so let me grab one. Okay, so this is the book that we did for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. And let me give you just kind of a sense of how that works. Okay, so this is what I mean by that. This spread in this book relates to Woodrow Wilson, who was the president who signed the Federal Reserve Act. So we have a photograph of Woodrow Wilson signing the Federal Reserve Act, and then I put in a little penny that also has information about, that has a profile of Woodrow Wilson on it. And then I also included, since it's a history of the bank, a picture right here about that shows the front of the bank with purple bunting on it, very somber purple bunting when Woodrow Wilson died, just to show how important he was to the Federal Reserve System in general. That's kind of, so you have a lot of things to look at. You have information-rich captions. On the other side of the spread, there's just articles, just photographs of articles that were printed when the Federal Reserve Bank Chicago opened. And so there's just a lot to look at. There's still a lot to read here, but you can kind of scan it and pick what you want information about. Now, in general, and that's sort of just the approach I took all throughout the book. Okay, this is at one point, when we take old currency out of circulation, we destroy it by burning it. That's a picture.
Burning money.
They're burning. Who would have thought, right? But there's just a lot of different photographs in here about the process of. And these are all the different currencies, currency that we currently have that reference the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago.
I don't think I've ever seen one, the $5,000 note.
Right. Well, they're not in circulation anymore, but they were at one point. And if it's issued, distributed by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, it would be indicated right here on that little seated. So there's just a lot of interesting history that I included, and it's all done in pictures. And I think that's why I had some pretty good feedback that people really liked it.
Yes, I think this will be a very interesting book for us.
Now, another one that I did was related to, let me grab this one. This was related to my father's artwork, same deal. But he was just a very prolific artist, and he still is. And he just did all these different paintings over the years. So what I did is that I would just take each painting and I would just ask him to give me a quote about the painting and what it sort of was all about. So this becomes sort of a profile of how an artist approaches his work, all the things that can influence him.
What does he see in the painting?
Sure.
What makes it a focus? And this is wonderful. This is a really enjoyable way to read.
Well, thank you. And then I tried to do that. I'll get this last one out here about tall trees. Now, this is the Tall Trees book, and it's kind of the same thing. It's but this is a little section called On the First Residence. Okay. This is the section over the fight over, there's that little Navy ditch that runs through the back of Tall Trees. This is a section on the closing of Chestnut.
That we talked about,
when the Lake Street entrance opened, things like that. It's all just compartmentalized. That's sort of the main point I was trying to make.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
I think your tips will help our viewers very much on organizing their books, and many of them are working on.
Well, it also makes it a little easier to get started, because I think it can be sort of formidable to think, oh, I have to write just this long narrative. Maybe you can just write one section. That's what got me started. Just jump in and do one chapter. Don't worry about writing the whole book. Just try to do one chapter. Just do, you found out something about whatever you want to write about, especially if it's a history.
That's a great tip.
And then if and then it becomes you're doing it in chunks, and then it doesn't seem as formidable a task, and it's a lot easier to get started.
But that's a great tip, Dan. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
And thank you for watching. Join us next time on Off the Shelf.